Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Forest and Rangelands Stewardship Department Graduate Seminar. That's a mouthful. Today we have Lauren Porensky, who is a research ecologist with the USDA ARS. She received her doctorate from UC Davis, and today she's going to be talking to us about some of her research. So she'll be telling us a story about cheatgrass invasion and fire, and it might not be the normal story that we're used to hearing. So with that, I'll let Lauren take it away.
Thanks, Sonia. I just wanted to point out for students in the room that I do work for the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and if you guys don't know about us, I encourage you to come check us out, either for collaboration or for future employment. It's a pretty cool organization, and we're just south of campus. So I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dana Blumenthal, who's in the room, who will be answering all the questions. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about wildfires and cheatgrass in northeast Wyoming today. So, wildfire invasion. These two processes are often tightly linked, and there's several reasons for that. Fire can damage or kill resident species in an ecosystem, and that can really open up space for new species to come in. Fire can also release resources for invasives, and I should say here I'm talking about plants, invasion by plants. So by releasing resources, fire can really give invasives a chance to get established in an ecosystem. And fire can especially favor invasives that are better able to handle fire than the natives that were already in the system. And this can be especially true in systems that don't have a big history of wildfire, that are being invaded by plants from ecosystems that have a long history of wildfire. And invasives themselves can make this problem worse if they promote more fire. And this is a process that we see a lot in the western US, especially with grasses. So we have several annual grasses and some perennial grasses as well, whose invasion is linked to fire in the western US. And I'm going to be focusing on annual bromes. There's a bunch of annual bromes in the western US right now. Some are more well known than others, or more infamous than others. And these species all sort of are related to fire. I'm going to be focusing in particular on Bromus arvensis, which is field brome. That one is most common in the Great Plains. And then Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass, which is most common in the Intermountain West. Both of these species were introduced to the US in the 1800s. And while Bromus arvensis is sort of exists in the ecosystem but hasn't taken over its ecosystem in the Great Plains, Bromus tectorum has a very different story in the Great Basin. So, cheatgrass. At least 40 million hectares in the western United States have been negatively impacted by cheatgrass invasion. This is a close-up picture of cheatgrass, and this picture is kind of fuzzy, but all this stuff in the foreground that's red and green is cheatgrass, and cheatgrass can really form big monocultures and replace shrublands in the Intermountain West and the Great Basin. In the background here you can see sort of a remnant patch of shrubs. But yeah, in the foreground it's pretty much all cheatgrass. And this kind of conversion causes a lot of negative impacts, including obviously reduced plant diversity, but also big impacts to wildlife habitat, and also reductions in livestock weight gains. Cheatgrass can really alter carbon and nitrogen cycling in these ecosystems, and it can cause a big increase in costs associated with fighting fires and trying to restore invaded areas. So cheatgrass is a big problem in a lot of areas, and a lot of people are trying to find ways to deal with it. So how does cheatgrass take over? A lot of you are probably familiar with this, but cheatgrass tends to increase wildfires. And the way it does that is by filling in gaps between species that formerly were separated by bare ground. So that increases connectivity of fires. And cheatgrass also provides a lot of fine fuels in these areas. So by doing that, cheatgrass tends to increase both the extent of fires by connecting landscapes better, and also the frequency by causing more ignitions. And burn sites are highly susceptible to further invasion. And this is especially true in the Great Basin. We know that fire in the Great Basin tends to take out shrubs. These are systems that aren't really adapted to frequent fire. And cheatgrass is really good at coming into these ecosystems and basically doing really well after fires, much better than the native plants. So more invasion tends to lead to more fire, which tends to lead to more invasion, and that feedback cycle can lead to converted ecosystems like this one I work on in Nevada, which is basically all cheatgrass and a few exotic forbs, and you have to walk for a long time to find a native in systems like this. And this is the story that we hear, and that has been pretty intensively studied in the area circled in red here, which is basically the Great Basin and a little bit of ecosystems to the north of that. And in these ecosystems, cheatgrass really has the potential to convert whole ecosystems. So what I was curious about is whether cheatgrass can play this same game in the Western Great Plains. And there are a couple of reasons why we might think it would not be able to convert whole ecosystems in the Western Great Plains. One reason is that we have a really different climate in the Great Plains. Cheatgrass is a winter annual, so it germinates and comes up right now. I was just in Arizona and it's up and going. And it overwinters above ground and then it seeds out early in the spring. And here in the Great Plains, we also have a lot of rainfall in the summer, which is when cheatgrass is dormant. It's just sitting there as seed, and so it can't take advantage of that rain. But a lot of our natives are able to really take advantage of that rainfall that happens during the summer. We also have a really different history of fire and grazing in the Great Plains. So our natives are pretty tolerant of above ground disturbances like fire and grazing due to a long evolutionary history of those disturbances. So, given those things, might cheatgrass respond differently to fire in the Great Plains and the Great Basin? And there's been some work in the Great Plains on this issue, and all of it has to do with prescribed burning studies. There's a few on Bromus arvensis, which is not cheatgrass but closely related, showing that prescribed burning can reduce Bromus arvensis, or a combination of Bromus arvensis and Bromus hectorum. And most of these studies were prescribed burns in the fall or spring, which should be the most negative for cheatgrass because it's actually active in the fall and spring. A couple studies were actually on summer prescribed burns, and a couple of those included cheatgrass, but also reported on Bromus arvensis and the native 6-week fescue or Vulpio optiflora. And all of these studies, none of these studies looked at cheatgrass separate from these other species. So it was always lumped together with other species that are more common in the Great Plains. And I just wanted to show you where those studies took place. So the blue stars on this map sort of show an arc of studies that focused on Bromus arvensis, not Bromus hectorum, but showing that prescribed fire might be able to reduce Bromus arvensis in those places. And then the two dark red reported on cheatgrass and Bromus arvensis together, showing that prescribed fire might be able to reduce those two things. So there's some evidence suggesting that, okay, fire might not behave the same in the Great Plains as it does in the Great Basin for these species. But many continue to wonder about and manage for cheatgrass fire feedbacks in the Western Great Plains. And this isn't just because people aren't paying attention. There's several good reasons to be concerned. One is that wildfires are not the same as prescribed fires. Prescribed fires often occur when fire weather is not as extreme, and therefore they might not be as severe or as intense as a wildfire. Another difference between wildfires and prescribed fires is that most prescribed fires occur in the spring or fall. Wildfires occur during the summer, usually. And because of that, wildfires might have more negative impacts on natives compared to the exotics, since cheatgrass is dormant during the summer, but natives are still active. So that's one reason to wonder if this is still a concern. Another reason is that no studies have really occurred in closer to the sagebrush steppe ecosystem, so basically in the ecotone between the Great Plains and the Great Basin. So people who are living in sort of a grassland, shrubland interface really don't know what's going on with cheatgrass and fire. And then the third thing is, like I said, all these studies in the Great Plains are on either Bromus arvensis or some combination of cheatgrass and Bromus arvensis, and sometimes also some other species. And it's possible that these different brooms don't respond the same way to fire, but we don't know, we haven't been able to separate them yet. in the work that exists. So if Bromus arvensis is harmed by fire, but Bromus tectorum actually does well in old burns, that's important to know because cheatgrass could be on the rise in these ecosystems. Okay, so I studied fire and cheatgrass in Thunder Basin, which is in northeast Wyoming. It's really on this ecotone between a grassland and a shrubland. You can see here we have shrubs in the system. They really vary in their cover. There's some areas that don't have much shrub cover at all, and some areas that have almost as much as in the Great Basin. And then we have this really thick grass understory in most places. So we have sort of this ecotonal environment, and we might expect this environment to be a great place to study this question of, do we get different responses in the Great Plains and the Great Basin, and in the area between them, what's going on? Do we get a response that's more similar to the Great Plains studies that have been done or to the Great Basin story? Okay, so I just wanted to put this on the map for you. It's in northeast Wyoming, between the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains. So it's sort of a little further west than the existing Great Plains work, and also a little closer to the sort of typical Intermountain West flora. So this is the major land resource areas in Wyoming, and I just wanted to point out this is Thunder Basin National Grassland where I did this work, and it's really, here's the Black Hills, here's the Intermountain Basins, and it's really right in between those two things. And also north-south, it's sort of an interesting transition zone between our typical shortgrass steppe ecosystem and then northern mixed prairie ecosystems up in Montana. So sort of at the interface of all these different ecoregions. So it's an interesting place to work for sure. This is a close-up of the grassland, and I just wanted to put this up there. This is land ownership in the background. So the orange is BLM, the white is private, the gray is state, and the green is Forest Service. So there's a lot of collaborators, and I'm happy to take questions. I think we have a little time for questions. So thanks.
Did you look at, and I apologize if I missed it, subsampling to look at time since fire, and maybe all these old fires are sort of outweighing the newer fires?
Yeah, so we had fire age as one of our hypotheses. So basically the idea that brums would be promoted in recent burns, but then that effect would go away over time. And for both species, for both occurrence and abundance, that model had no support. So it was much worse than the null model, which just was like nothing affects brooms. So didn't appear to be the case. I actually have, this figure shows, this is fire date, and this is annual grasses in the middle, and the red is inside fires and the blue is outside fires. So if anything, it seems like the reduction of brooms due to fire goes away over time.
Was the grazing practices across the Great Basin pretty similar for your different plots? And what do we know about the interaction between fire and grazing and cheatgrass in this area?
So we know very little about fire and grazing and cheatgrass in this area. We know a fair amount in the Great Basin. I think, yeah, I haven't delved into the differences in grazing practices during the period of these fires. I do know that in the Great Basin, 100 years ago, they had very intensive grazing, and that allowed cheatgrass to get a foothold in a lot of places out there. And there has been recent work showing that in the Great Basin, still, grazing tends to open up spaces between perennial bunch grasses, and cheatgrass can take advantage of those spaces. So in the Great Basin, we know that grazing has helped cheatgrass in the past and still has a relationship with it. In the Great Plains, I think we know very little about that interaction, but because our native plants out here are so tolerant of grazing, I imagine that it probably has less of an effect on reducing natives and helping cheatgrass. So we are hoping to do some targeted grazing work on cheatgrass to look at if we graze it when it's most vulnerable, can we hurt it more in the Great Plains, like grazing it late in the fall or early in the spring. So, yeah.
Just wondering if you looked at, or anybody looked at using prescribed fire as a management tool in the Thunder Basin?
So they are using it. Parts of the Thunder Basin are being managed for prairie dogs and ferret reintroduction. And in those areas, people have been interested in doing prescribed fire. This issue of cheatgrass has been a real sort of concern, and so it's limited the amount of fire that's happened up there. And the other thing that's been a concern is the fact that simultaneously this landscape is trying to be managed for sagebrush associated species like sage-grouse, and so burning up reduces sagebrush dramatically. And so from that perspective, people are concerned about introducing too much fire. But yeah, it has been done, not very much, but a little bit.
It seems like your research kind of suggests that it could be used because of how productive the native plants are, that it could be used to really combat that if done at the right time. And I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the issue is when and where, and if we can sort of identify areas on the landscape that we don't mind burning up shrubs on, like areas that we want to focus on ferrets and things like that, then I think this work suggests that using fire will not cause a lot of invasion issues. So that's good news for the Forest Service up there. Yeah.
This seems a little bit like grasping at straws, but with the fires and the road situation, could there be more fires at different times of the year near the roads? Maybe fires being caused by cigarettes or rocks, or, as opposed to just like...
Yeah, I looked into that briefly and did not find it to be the case. There is a railroad that causes a lot of fires at all different times of year, but a lot of those sites have been reburned over and over again near the railroad, and so I excluded them from this study. But I'm hoping to go back and look at that a little bit more. Yeah, I think it might be worth checking into that again. For this work, most of the fires were pretty much between June and August, with a few exceptions, so I don't think it's a big deal, but it's possible. Yeah.
I'm interested in your findings with the southeast facing slopes. So based mostly on observation, working in the western 2/3 of Wyoming, I came to expect cheatgrass on southern and western exposures. And so I'm wondering what you think it is. Well, first of all, is it mostly the southern exposure that's driving that southeast result, or is there something special about east that's why did you
It's
find
really
west?
southeast, not just south. We looked at that and found that, yeah, it seems to be more southeast. I think this landscape gets a lot of wind and a lot of drifting, probably like your areas. And it seems like southeast might be a little more sheltered from that weather in this landscape, and I'm wondering if that might allow it to pick up more snow and get more water. I don't know if you find that with your sites.
Well, we were really focusing on the hotter, drier areas, expecting that's where we'd see the cheatgrass come in. So that's kind of what I was asking, because your results kind of suggest maybe it's not the hottest or driest, but picking up those drift areas, a little bit moister,
hot and
higher
wet seems to be the best here. Yeah. So we did look at just south, and it wasn't as good. And I think trying to remember how it was exactly. I think that pattern was really driven by the fact that in northwest quadrants there was like no cheatgrass, so whatever was going on in the northwest was not good